here we go. So what we are looking at is basically the footer area, or the lowest part of the template, the web page that we've basically been coding. We started with the PSD, and we coded kind of the container areas first. We started building it from the top down, and the last element left to cover basically is the content that's being shown in the footer. As I move my cursor around, you can see this dark kind of charcoal gray area and the horizontal line it creates at the top. This is the topmost area of the main footer division, a footer, or a division with an ID of footer, a div with an ID of footer. Inside of that area is also the bottommost part of this container graphic, the part with the white rounded corners, etc. Because of the way that we built this to overlap. Basically, we've got this kind of segmented now, the entire footer div. We've got it segmented into two parts, the top area, footer 1, and the bottom area, which is on this really dark, almost black color down here, footer 2. As I tab over to the next page, you'll see the first area that we're basically going to add to the page and then discuss both the HTML and the CSS that caused it to exist. So this content here now is the content inside of the div with an ID of footer 1. And it contains basically 3 columns of varying sizes and, of course, varying content as well. We'll notice that each one of the areas does have basically a title above it. This has been styled with an H4 heading, and since these are consistent, basically the styling for each of these is the same. They're the same font type, the same font size, the same font color, etc. We've attacked the H4 as a group, not individually. And that's something to note when you create your CSS. You can narrow down CSS to each individual element, and sometimes you have to, and you'll see that as we go through this training today. But if you don't have to, it's best to let the cascading effect, the understanding that you can style multiple elements at one time is also a very good thing. It allows you to write less CSS code, which is good both for keeping the file sizes down, and of course it's also way better when you have to come back to a document that you might have to edit in the future, because there's a lot less to look at. So these have been styled basically all at the same time with one CSS controlling the H4 heading. However, we do have these columns, each of these different areas. You can see that the leftmost column is definitely wider than either of the two right-hand columns, and you'll see how that works. And we'll talk about the simple contact form and how it's styled currently with different hover colors and even different colors. If I click inside of a certain input area, it changes to all white, and we'll talk about all that right now. So let's jump over to Edit Plus and basically just discuss all of the content that's going on here. I guess I should point out that it might not be immediately noticeable that there are any links in this area because we've basically turned off the default styling. But over here in the latest news category, again, it's an HTML web page, but we are simulating kind of the content that you would show if you were building a WordPress theme. Under latest news, this might draw content from your latest blog posts, and you'll notice that the content that shows on top of this orange graphic shows a date, basically 03.17, representing March 17th, and of course you can show this in different formats through PHP if you decide to turn this into a WordPress theme. And then here to the right of it is a shortened, abbreviated version of the actual post title, basically. And you'll notice that if I hover over it, it changes color, and you can see by the cursor that it is indeed a link. So this would take, basically, or it's to simulate the fact that it would take the visitor straight over to a particular page or post. So we do have a couple of link stylings in here. Other than that, most of it is just, a little bit of image styling, Text styling, obviously, both in sizes and colors. And then, of course, we've got this a little more complex area over here in regards to the contact form. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Edit Plus, and we'll just attack these basically columns, one column at a time, starting from the left. All right, so I've already provided the source files in the last section, so you should have the source files already for these. I am going to submit and send out this batch of source files, basically the index pages I currently have named 6, 7, and 8, along with the new style sheet, only because I went through the code again as I was preparing for this webinar and found that I had written some extraneous code that really wasn't necessary. There was some CSS specifically that wasn't even really being used, and I didn't want to confuse, so I removed it. So I will give you the source files, the new source files, and it would really be best to work off of these, especially as you try to kind of pair them up with this particular video, because if you try to pair them up with the other source files, you'll find out that some of the stuff is no longer there. So when looking at the CSS file, for me on Edit Plus, you can see it shows at line 310, we've left a CSS comment that says footer, and all of the comments or all of the CSS rules basically that follow below all pertain to that footer area. Again, with the understanding that we have a main footer division, a main footer div, and then inside of that we've broken it up into footer 1 and footer 2. Go take a look at let's go look at index 6, which is really the very first image or the very first web page that I showed you today. That has no content in the footer area at all. So if I start from the bottom and I use my cursor to highlight, you'll see that we've left an HTML comment here that reminds you that this is where we've closed the footer div. And if I highlight it from that point all the way up, you can see through Edit Plus right now in HTML we're dealing with, for index 6, we're dealing with lines 124 through 142. The topmost bit of HTML on line 124 starts with a div with an ID of footer. And again on 142 there's the closing div tag and the HTML comment to allow you to know that that was the closing div tag for the whole entire footer area. So everything that's inside of that footer area then is contained right now between lines 124 and 142. Of course, this is going to grow as we continue to add content. If we jump back over to the CSS document, I did want to point out one thing, and that's right here. This is, again, the number sign or the hashtag or the pound sign, whichever way you're used to referring to that symbol. This has anything with an ID of footer. Well, you'll notice that there's no rules, or there's no declarations rather, between the opening and closing curly brackets. Basically, there's no CSS being assigned or controlling the footer div. So I just wanted to point that out. There's nothing really happening on that div container as a whole. We've really only used it just to identify that entire area for us, the web developer, and for you, our web dev course students. So this, because it's completely empty, you are welcome to completely get rid of it. It won't change anything. Again, there's no declarations assigned to that particular ID at all. I just wanted to point out that it's there, and it doesn't need to be. Underneath that now, we're starting to see CSS rules, and again, each one of these is an individual rule, and each one of these lines is an individual declaration, just as a reminder. We're starting to see CSS rules that are assigned basically to anything with an ID of footer 1. We're going to get into some more complex CSS today, just in the way that things are built. But as a quick reminder, whenever you see, like on line 317, whenever you see this, you should do a couple of things. You should look for commas, see if there's any commas in this top line. and we'll find some here in just a bit, and I'll describe that as we come to it. If you don't find any commas, then the next thing to do is start to the far right and then work your way from the far right over to the left. So the declarations inside of here are basically controlling anything that has an ID, and again we know it's an ID because it has the number sign as opposed to being preceded by a period, which is a class. So anything with an ID of footer-1 is being controlled by these CSS declarations. On the next line, basically we have, starting from the right, we have something with a class of content, and if it finds something with a class of content that is also contained inside of something with an ID of footer-1, then it's supposed to assign these particular CSS declarations. These are the rules whenever that happens. And we'll see how that builds here in just a minute. What we're going to do now is pop over to the HTML. And like I said, we're going to start one column at a time and one element at a time. And I'll do my best to go slow and to basically define kind of what's going on. So let's scroll back up here just so we can see where we're starting. We're starting with a div with an ID of footer. And again, like I just said just a minute ago, we really aren't using CSS to do anything to that particular div. We've only used a div with an ID of footer just to give us a main container area to let us know, hey, this is the stuff that's contained in the footer. Right underneath it, though, you'll see that we have div with an ID of footer1, and we are using CSS to control it. So the first question then is, okay, what are we, everything that comes in the footer1 div, which goes all the way down to here, basically, all three of those columns 1, 2, and 3, are contained in that same horizontal area that we've labeled div with an ID of footer-1. So let's go back to the CSS and see what we're doing. Well, what we're doing is a couple of things. Number one, we've set a minimum height by using the min-height property of 300 pixels. So that just basically means that we know, that the content in that area, is going to take up at least 300 pixels in height, and so therefore we've set a minimum height value. You'll notice that we don't have a max height value, and that is another appropriate property for CSS, because that area definitely could grow. Maybe we wanted to add 3. If I jump back over to the live, oops, where am I at here? Yeah, I guess I do it that way. If we wanted to change this and allow it to show 3 posts, we would need obviously more space vertically, and we would need this this entire area, to be able to grow automatically in its height. And that we've left that option open because of the fact that through CSS we have not set a maximum height. We've only set a minimum height. We are controlling that medium dark gray background color with the background color property, and it is set to a hexadecimal color code of 252525. And then we've also added a border on the bottom, basically of the entire div area footer-1. It's a thin line. The smallest or thinnest line you can make through CSS, just by the way, is 1 pixels. You can't, I wish you could, but you can't make a 0.5 pixel line even thinner. 1 pixel is the smallest or thinnest line that you can make, and of course that's not an issue of CSS. It's really an issue of the screen. The screen is built in pixels, and so that's the minimum value we have to work with. The line itself, the line type, is a solid line. It could be dotted or dashed or grooved or others, but it's a solid line, and the last part of this declaration, this last part of this value, sets that particular color. So if we look at again, look at footer1 just kind of quickly. what we're basically saying is we've assigned a minimum height of 300 pixels to this area. We're using a background color to give it this medium dark gray, and this line at the bottom, there's actually two lines down here, a bottom line on footer 1 and a top line on footer 2 to kind of give it this cool kind of effect. But that one of the border lines is being controlled basically by the border bottom property. So inside of that now, if we go back to the HTML, the next thing we're going to find is this div with a class of bg-bottom, and you'll see that it's opened and closed on the same line for me at the moment on line 124. I mentioned this already, but basically what's happening here is nothing more. You'll notice that there's no content between the opening and closing div tags. And this confuses a lot of people when they first start, because they expect to find content between opening and closing tags, and of course you frequently will. In this case, though, if we go back and look at the CSS, I can tell you that what's happening is this div class is only being used in conjunction with the CSS to output that bottom image of the container. So let's go back, let's go back to CSS first, and let's see, I don't think it's actually in this area. We'd have to find, let's see, right here, bg-bottom is the class. So we're looking for something with the class of bg-bottom, and that's right here, or bg-bot, short for bottom. And all that's doing is outputting the background image. In this case, it's that white image with the drop shadow that overlays basically the footer area. So it is next in line in the HTML code, but I just wanted to point out that it's basically it's higher up in the CSS. It's not in that same area. If you're looking for it in the same area, you won't find it. You'll need to look higher up. Inside of that now, we have another division with a class of content, and basically this new div segments yet again, and that's what you can kind of think of these divs. They're all basically containers to segment content, to segment elements. And inside of now even footer 1, we've got this div with a class of content. And even though I didn't use an HTML comment to show you where it's closed, I can just quickly kind of look at the code and tell you that it's closed right here. So this div right here, just prior to the closing footer 1, is the closing div tag for the content. So all of that is held within that particular div. And then inside of that now, we have the 3 divs that control each of the individual columns. You'll see this one is calling out column 1, the next one is calling out column 2, and the next one is calling out column 3. So like I said, we're going to discuss each column from left to right, basically column 1 before 2 before 3. Let's go take a look at content. Going back down into where we find the footer area. We'll notice that that entire group, not individually by columns, but that entire block of all 3 column content is being controlled with this next CSS rule. Again, if we start to the right, we see anything with a class of content that's also inside of anything with an ID of footer-1. Here's what you're supposed to do. Set the overall width of this division, this div, to 970 pixels. And then we're using margin, the margin property set to 0, which again, if you have 2 values, the first refers to the top and bottom. So no extra margin, or basically 0 margin to the top of this div, 0 margin to the bottom of it, and the auto command sets the margins left and right. So since we've given this area a width, the browser has the ability to automatically know how to center this content. It takes the browser width, whatever that is in pixels, and of course it's unique to the visitor. I'm on a screen that has 1600 pixels in width. You might be on a screen that has more. You might have 1920. You might have less. You might have a 1024 monitor. It really doesn't matter. It takes the browser, or it takes the screen width rather of the actual viewer of your web page. It subtracts the width that you're calling it out, divides it by 2, and then assigns that value to auto, basically giving an automatic or evenly spaced margin on the left and right. And that's what's causing that content to be centered on the page. If we were to basically comment out the margin declaration, again with the understanding that you can comment out CSS with / before it, and then the reverse * after it. If we were to do this, we should see that basically the content is no longer centered. So just understand that that is basically what we're doing to center the text. So removing the temporary CSS comment tags from around that particular declaration puts us back to where we were. The next, anytime that you see color by itself, the color property, this is really referring to the foreground color, or you can also kind of remember it in your mind. It's really referring primarily to text colors. So it's saying that any of the content that is inside of this this div with a class of content, or anything with a class of content really, it's also some inside of anything with an ID of footer 1, to make the foreground color this gray color. Of course, you have the ability through CSS to override things, and you're going to see that that's going to happen here. But by default, and by the cascade effect, go put this back to where it was, all of this text is a very light gray. It might look white, this text right here, might look white to you on the screen, but it's actually a very light gray. However, this text, the title text, I can tell you is pure white, but you start having to ask yourself, well, wait a minute, obviously this text is orange, this text is pure white, and this text is that light gray. Yet what we're doing is we're telling it through CSS to use the foreground color of this light gray for this entire div with a class of content. So the cascading effect is causing all of this text temporarily to be the light gray until it finds a more specific rule that says, okay, ignore what I told you previously, now do this. And that's basically, again, an understanding, or just I'm hoping that you're kind of getting your head wrapped around the cascade effect and how it works, and how you can override the cascade effect if you're writing CSS rules that are more specific than others. This blanket color value is being basically assigned to the entire div itself with a class of content, and later we can come and more specifically attack different areas like this business name and the phone to say, okay, we don't really want that to be light gray, we really want it to be this particular color in orange. So back to Edit Plus we go. So now going back to the HTML, we now understand how we've centered the entire column content, and we've understand. Yeah, Jerry?
Someone's asking, does it matter where the rules are placed in the CSS code?
Yes. So let's go back to CSS, the cascading effect, and it really, while you're first messing with it and you're trying to get your mind wrapped around it, the cascade effect is frustrating. And later on, you're going to find out that it's wonderful. It's one of those things that it just takes a while to understand. So yes, it can definitely affect things in regards to your order. So let me demonstrate this live. This wasn't something that I was going to do, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to copy this entire CSS rule, and I'm going to paste it below. I mean verbatim. Okay? So now what we have is we have two exact identical CSS rules, both trying to control this div or anything with a class of content inside of something with an ID of footer -1. The first one says set the color to this light gray, and the second one now I'm going to set it to a color of dark red, and that's the hexadecimal value for dark red, or a dark red. So now, since we basically have two conflicting pieces of CSS, one of them is saying to color the foreground color or the text color with this light gray. The second one says, nope, use this dark burgundy red. Because this rule comes after, it's lower in the code than this one, it will take precedence. We are going to see that all of that text that's not controlled some other way is automatically going to become red, and it's happening again because it's lower in the code. So let's just watch kind of how that works. Again, we're talking about the footer area here, and now we've got everything that was initially styled to be that light gray is now that red. If we don't do anything else but just reorder these now, I just cut this, I leave it exactly as it is, and I paste it above. Now we're basically just reversing the order of those two rules, and I save it. Now we know that it's going to go back to gray, even though it's got rules that say to do both. Now the gray rule basically comes second, and now we're back to gray. So the answer to your question is, can the order of CSS change things in the way that they're displayed? The answer is absolutely yes, and you've just seen that visually. There is more to the understanding of cascading, though, than just the order of placement. See, because sometimes when you ask me, does the order of CSS change things, the answer is both yes and no. If the order of things, basically if you're attacking two completely different things, then it doesn't matter. For instance, I only have one CSS rule that's telling this particular content to float to the left. Well, it doesn't matter, because that's true. It doesn't matter whether I have that rule here or whether I have it up here. So that is not going to change anything. Everything is going to stay exactly as it is, because we don't have basically two conflicting rules. So please understand that just because we talked about that there can be a definite connection between the order of your CSS and what basically happens as a result of the order, that's not necessarily the case. If that were the case, wow, CSS would become extremely complex. So you would have to start thinking about, every single rule that you were about to make, would have to, if it had to come in some exact order, would make this entire thing very, very complex. And it's not that complex. The other side of the cascade, though, and there's a couple of things, and we're going to get to, I was going to get to another one later, but we might just talk about it now, since it's really wrapped up in the same kind of a topic as the question. When you assign a particular rule that starts to cascade, and by that I mean this: we have assigned this rule right here, footer-1 with a class of content. We've said, look, anything inside of that, you should make the foreground color or the text color this light gray. We know that we have orange text in that area. We know that we have white text in that area. So the question then becomes, well, how is that achieved? How come we've assigned basically this foreground color to everything in that div area with a class of content? How come those other things are not light gray? How can they be orange? How can they be white? the way that that happens is a couple things. Number one, again, with the understanding is if you have two CSS rules that are trying to do the same thing, then it's going to look and use the value for the one that's further down in the code. That's the first thing. The second thing is something called specificity, meaning the more specific your CSS rule is, the more likely it's going to use that rule as opposed to one that's a little bit more general. And so here's what I'm saying with that. I've told you that those headings inside of the footer area are heading 4s, and they are. And I've told you that they're being colored in white, which in hexadecimal is all Fs, either 3 or 6. And it's sizing it differently than all the other text. Rather than the default, it's using 24 pixel or larger text, and it's assigning a certain margin value to the headings. But the biggest thing I just want to point out is the color is white. Well, how is this happening? It's happening because this rule now is more specific than this one. It says, look, find headings, anything that's labeled in the HTML or tagged as a heading 4. It's also inside of something with the class of foot widget, which is also inside of something with an ID of footer 1. And if you find something that meets all that criteria, then here's what you're supposed to do: make it white text. So if we go down here, we're going to see that we have an H4 heading tag for latest news, and we'll see that that is wrapped inside of something with the div class of foot widget, and that is, of course, inside of something with the div ID of footer 1. So because it's more specific, it's going to ignore basically the previous command to style it as light gray, and it's going to style it as white and larger text, etc., with a different margin value for below it. In addition to that, and I don't know if I talked about this or not, but in addition to that, there's two other ways to kind of override the natural tendency for CSS to cascade. The first thing is what's referred to as oh, my mind just blanked. It's basically, well, it's the weight. It's anytime that you have something called out as an ID, again in your CSS. I guess I can point that out here. Let's do. How do we show you that? I guess we do it this way. Let's copy the H4 heading tag CSS. And I'm doing this live, and sometimes everything doesn't work even perfectly for me, but we're going to see. I think this should work, and I'm hoping that it will, and I'm hoping that it will help make this make more sense. Okay, so what I've done is I've copied the H4 CSS, and I've changed the color to red. Well, now we know that if I just save this, it's going to make it red because it comes lower in the CSS code. But here is something else that I want to show you. It's the fact that initially we're dealing with an ID. So if this was not an ID, if this was a class, by changing this to a period, classes have less weight or less importance basically in CSS than IDs do. So if it found conflicting code and it was trying to figure out which to use, whether to use something with the ID, something that was trying to be called out as an ID, or something that was trying to be called out as a class, the ID would win, regardless of whether it came first or not. So even if this is second, because the class has less weight than the ID, it would use the CSS rule for the ID. It would say, okay, even though the other comes after it, it's got less value or importance. Of course, I really can't show you this live on this particular example because I would have to actually jump over to the HTML, and we would have to change this from an ID. We'd have to change this from an ID to a class. However, doing that wouldn't be helpful because realistically, it would just be selecting one rule over another. So this isn't exactly the best example, and I apologize for that, but I'm hoping that maybe you just understand with weights, if you ever run into an issue where you're trying to mess with something in CSS and you're expecting a different outcome than you're getting, it is quite possible that you've got a conflict between maybe something that's being assigned earlier with an ID and something that's assigned later as a class, and maybe you're expecting it to follow what you've told it with the class, and it's not. If that's the case, see if you have something that's controlling it that has a value of an ID earlier in your code, because that may be the issue. The other way to do it, and this is something that you really shouldn't do all that often. Sometimes you do have to do it. I really wouldn't recommend that you do it though, unless you absolutely have to. But it is something good to know for testing. And so let me see. Let's see if we can do. Yeah, let's do that. This should work theoretically. I'm hoping it will. We copied this CSS rule just a bit ago, and we changed the color value to the dark red. And if I do it again, since it's the exact same rule, this one comes after it, we're going to see that that text again becomes dark red. But there is another cheat, basically. It's an acceptable cheat, but again, I don't want, it's really a crutch. And if you see it in CSS a lot, it's probably because the CSS creator doesn't really understand the cascade effect all that well. You will actually see it in our code. It is in here, I think, once. Like I said, there are some times when it needs to be used, but you really shouldn't use it any more than you absolutely have to. But it's what's called the important value. So it starts with an exclamation point. It's the word important in all lowercase, and here's how it works. So right now we know that that text is this dark red, and it's happening because it's choosing to use this lower CSS rule. However, if I decide up here under the color to add exclamation point important, just like that, theoretically, we'll see what happens. It should now override the cascading effect, the order of things, and it should turn the text back to light gray. And we'll see if I'm right or wrong, but I'm right. So now what you're looking at basically is this certain value which you can assign to any CSS declaration. It's basically a way that you say, wait a minute, ignore some other conflict. This is the one that's important. I want you to use this value regardless of whether you find some conflict lower down in the code. And realistically, I think it's important for you to know that this exists. Number one, because of course you're gonna probably routinely see it in CSS. But in addition to that, it can be another debugging tool or a teaching tool that you can use in addition to commenting out certain things. If you're trying to attack something through a CSS and it's simply just not allowing the change to take place, you might temporarily at least add the important tag to see if it changes. And if it does, then likely what's happening is you have a conflict with CSS cascade, the cascading effect. However, if your adding of the important value to the declaration makes no change, then there is likely a different problem. And I know Jerry's going to say something here in a second, but I'm going to run with this for just a second, Jerry.
Mm-hmm.
let's say that you've added important, and here's what I'm going to show you what I'm going to do live, because one of the things with web page design, and of course coding anything, whether it's a markup language like HTML, whether it's CSS styles, or something now more dynamic like PHP and JavaScript, and the list goes on, it is an exact science. There isn't a whole lot of margin for error, and that is something that might be hard for some people to kind of swallow if you're not someone who pays really close attention to detail. But I'm going to get rid of the E here, and we now know that we have a typo. We've got this thing that says content, but without a missing E. And as soon as I do that, we're going to see a problem. And we've got this problem now, right? The text is no longer aligned where it's supposed to be. The colors are no longer what they were supposed to be. We've got issues. So if you see issues and you say, oh, maybe it started like this for you, you did notice that there was a typo, and you're trying to control, you know what, I don't know why that color is just not switching for me. I'm going to go ahead and add the important tag to it, and that's going to fix it, because because Kevin said if you add important to it, it's going to override the cascade effect, and that's what's going to work. And if you try that and you see no change, then it is likely that it's not an issue with the CSS specifically as far as the cascade effect. There's something else going on. And in this particular case, what's really going on is it doesn't know how to add the rule now, because it's looking for something with a class of .contint, and it can't find it. So as soon, of course, as we we get rid of the typo, we have the ability to get rid of the important as well, because now it knows the CSS is looking for something with a class of content inside of something with an ID of footer-1, and when it finds it, it says, hey, here's what I'm supposed to do. And as soon as that's been put back to the way it was, we magically get the layout back and we get the text back. So I'm hoping that aids your understanding of CSS rules and the cascade effect in ordering things, and the use of the important tag, or rule rather. Yeah, Jerry?
Just wanted to point out that the important tag only deals with that one particular item, like you had on color. So even though it was duplicated farther down, so you're only modifying the tag that the line is on. It doesn't modify the whole.
Absolutely. So what Jerry's saying is that adding the important tag to the color doesn't make the entire rule override something lower. It only overrides, or basically only says, if you find a conflict, use this particular declaration. So if there was a conflict, excuse me, if there was a conflict with the width, or if there was a conflict with the margin, basically this particular declaration is trying to center the content, that would not change as a result of adding important to this one particular declaration. They're declaration specific. So I mean, if you really had problems with each, what you would have to do is this. And like I said, you really don't want to get into a habit where you're using the important tag unless you absolutely have to, and it's impossible for me to really kind of explain the areas in which you might have to. There's just certain times when, it may not even be have to is correct, there's certain times when the cascade effect can get so complex that debugging it just becomes a nightmare, and adding the important tag, once to your CSS isn't going to break anything. And so if you need to do it to fix something and go on with life, then I don't have a problem with that. I wouldn't want to see your CSS have 30 different important tags or important rules, values rather, all over the place, because that basically just starts to speak to the fact that maybe you still don't yet fully understand the cascade effect. And you really should, because once you do, like I said, at first it's It's kind of complex and it's hard to understand, but once you understand it, its actual use, the cascade effect, is so beneficial to you because you'll be able to style things so much more quickly when you understand that, hey, I can assign this one particular value and let it fall down across everything else because I mostly want to use, like for instance, you could style a paragraph with, the color black, since you have a white background, website, and then all of your paragraph content is all black, unless you come across some specific instance in which you don't want it to be black, and then you can style that uniquely in just those couple of instances, as opposed to having to go write, individual rules to, make, each individual piece of text, black. It's just the cascade effect is your friend, so long as you understand it. So are we good with that, Jerry? I'm going to take a drink of water, and if we're good with that, then we'll go.
Yeah, seems to be good.
Your confidence is overwhelming. All right. So we kind of jumped on that a little bit, but let's continue on. The next thing that we're going to find in the HTML, look down here, again, now that we're dealing with the first column of content, this is the first time I think that we've done this in CSS, and so it's important for you to know kind of what's going on. In all of the other times that we've assigned some either ID or class for some HTML element, whether it was a div or a span or a heading, etc., we basically had one word, like content, all together. And if we had kind of more than something, we had it attached with the use of a hyphen. It was all basically connected, no white space. This is the first instance in which that's not true. You'll see that we have a division with a class of foot widget, and then we have a space or some white space between it, and then we have another thing, col-1, short for column 1. Well, what does this really mean? What it means is we're assigning multiple classes to the same div. So what we're doing, because of this space between it, we're saying this div has a class of foot widget, and it also has a class of column 1. And yes, you can go further than this. You can assign more than 2. This kind of takes CSS to the next level, because what it's basically saying is, look for CSS that's trying to control anything with a class of foot widget, and also look for CSS that's trying to control something with a class of column 1 or col1 -1 to be specific, and assign both of those CSS rules to this one area. So if we look at the CSS now, we're going to see that we've got obviously still things with the div of ID, or with an ID of footer 1 rather, and now we have this bit of code that says if you find a class of column 1 inside of something with an ID of footer 1, here's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to give it an overall width of 340 pixels. You're supposed to give it some padding or space on the left-hand side of 15 pixels, and you're supposed to give it some padding or space on the right-hand side, again, of that, if you can imagine it in your brain, this rectangular shaped box or square box that's being created with this div with a class that has column 1 is basically this container area that's 340 pixels wide, and it's got 15 pixels of space on the left of it, and it's got 10 pixels of space on the right of it. In addition to that, going back to the HTML, it says also look and see what the web developer is trying to do or control in regards to foot widget. So go back to the CSS, and you see, oh, here we go. We have something with a class of foot widget that also lives inside of footer 1. as an ID. And what is it saying? It's saying to float that container to the left. So basically all that's saying is, if we go back to, let's see, the live page, this entire container area we know to be footer -1, and we know that we've styled it to be 970 pixels in width. It's saying put this content, actually this first column, float it to the left, make it all the way to the left inside of this main footer area. So we're doing two things. We're telling the content to float to the left. At the same time, we're also telling this entire area to be 340 pixels in width, and we're doing that basically through two different pieces of CSS. The reason why we didn't add extra declarations to the foot widget is because we want each one of these columns to be floated to the left, not just the first, but all of them. So this cascading effect, understanding again the cascade, it's saying anytime you find anything with a class of foot widget that's also inside something with an ID of footer1, float it to the left. And you'll see in the HTML that we're doing that for each. It's not just in column 1, but we're doing the same for column 2, and we're doing the same for column 3. And that's the reason that each one of those blocks of content, basically, go back to the live page again, is sitting horizontally here. Remember that divs are block level elements, and by their nature, they want to stack vertically. Without the floating, it wants to, again, understanding that floating is basically another way to say that you're taking a block level element out of its normal kind of flow, and you're telling it to behave differently than it usually would. Block level elements, remember that they want to create a hard line break, and they want to start on a new line. And if we removed the float left, if I comment that out, and hoping dynamically this works since I didn't test this ahead of time, but it should, we have this effect where the footer area has grown, as I mentioned earlier. We didn't set a maximum height to it, so we can see that that's working. The problem is that our footer area no longer displays horizontally, it's displaying vertically, and that's happening as a result of the commenting out of the float left. So that entire, basically everything with a class of foot widget is being told to float left, which is basically what's allowing it to show up horizontally as opposed to vertically. And then inside of that now, the next rule down says if you find a heading 4, an H4, that's inside of the class of something with a class of foot widget that's also inside of something with an ID of footer-1, now you're to make the text color or the foreground color white, and it's supposed to be 24 pixels, and it should have 25 pixels of margin to the bottom, basically expanding the space to the bottom or underneath that H4 heading. If we go back to the live page and refresh, we'll see that, like I said, because of the cascade effect, even though we're trying to deal with column 1, the CSS is really controlling more than that because of the cascade effect. Each one of these H4s is 24 pixels. Each one of these H4s is 24 pixels. It's white, it's 24 pixels in height, and it has 25 pixels of margin to the bottom. Okay? Going back to the CSS, again, with the understanding that all we've done for the column 1 is to set the overall width of the column and then to give it a little bit of spacing to the left and right. And let's go back and take a look at the rest of the HTML. So we've basically covered this, because again, that's the first foot widget is allowing it to float left or stay horizontally basically, and the second, the column 1 class, is sizing this column 340 pixels in width and giving it some padding to the left and right. We've already talked about the H4 and how that's working. The next is this next div, this div with a class of title. It's on this one line. You'll see that it's opened here at the beginning and it's closed here at the end. And inside of that we have some other HTML. We've got a span tag being used. Starts here, closes here. The entire span element is right there. The content between it is that date that is appearing over that orange image. And then next we have that link, the A tag, and we are linking the text. We hired a new CEO ... And as mentioned earlier, we were just linking it to the number sign just as a default link. So we've got a span and we have a anchor tag or the A tag, both being used inside of something with a div with a class of title. So let's go take a look at that. There's nothing really all that interesting with what we're doing with the paragraph, but this div with a class of title is affecting both of these pieces. So we really only have to talk about it once. The rest of this paragraph is pretty simplistic. So back to the CSS we go. We're looking for something with a div with a class of title, and we will go find that now. So here's what we got right here. Again, look for commas in the CSS rule, the first line of it. And if you don't find commas, then you can start effectively to the right and understand what's happening. It's saying if you find an A tag, or basically a link, inside of something that has a class of title, inside of something that has a class of COL-1, inside of something that has an ID of footer-1, here's what you're supposed to do. This is basically just attacking that link. It says to make the font size of the link text 14 pixels, to make the color this particular color, which I think is the same color we've actually assigned to the entire text. And the reason that we used a color value, then you say, well, why did you need to do that if you're already assigning the color for that entire div with a class of content? Why did you need to assign a color value here? And the reason is that by default browsers try to cause links to be blue. So when it comes to links, you're going to want to color your text if you want it to do something different than the default, because the browser, by default, the browser CSS is going to try to override and cause your non-visited links to be blue and your visited links to be purple, and it's going to make them want to be underlined, etc. So the font weight for this particular link text is being told to be bold. And then the next down here, it says, okay, well, what else do we want it to do? Well, this is what's referred to as a pseudo element, and we've discussed this before. We discussed this when we talked about the main navigation. A with a colon, anytime you see the colon here, that's basically part of the main CSS rule, how it's trying to attack the CSS in the selector. A:hover is a pseudo element that basically says anytime that the user tries to hover over the link, here's what you're supposed to do. Change it to white, and you'll notice that we've included the important tag on this one because it was basically being tricky on me. So I added it here to force it to follow this rule. And I'm saying I don't want any text decoration. When you hover over it, I don't want any text decoration at all. I just want to change the color from light gray to white. Yeah, Jerry.
Somebody asked if column 3 was placed above column 1 in the CSS, it would show on the far left, even though it was labeled column 3.
Okay, it's kind of outside of what we're talking about. So the question then is, if column 3, he's talking about inside of the HTML?
No, inside of the CSS.
Inside of the CSS, it wouldn't change. Yeah, so if you were to take let's see here, we got a footer one, I missed it. Where is, let's see, column 2, where is column 3? Right
It's
here.
up above.
If you were to take column 3,
Mm-hmm.
and put it above column 1, so now you have column 3, column 1, column 2, we're not going to find any change. Everything stays the same. What's controlling it, remember that the CSS is connected to the HTML. It's a direct connection to the HTML. The HTML is what's controlling the, in this case, it's what's controlling the order of things. It's what's or defining the content. So if we changed the order of the HTML block, we would see things would reorder. I'm not going to do it, but I will show you what I'm talking about. So over here we have this div that's footer with column 1. Next is footer with column 2. If I were to cut this out and to paste it above column 1, this content would show up to the far left, and you could have the ability to reorder your content that way, but it would be done in the HTML, not in the CSS. Okay. Back to what we were. We were looking at the link text, anything inside of the class of title that was also inside of footer 1 ID. So if we look at the live page again, we'll see that the text, we hired a new CEO. It's the same light gray color as all of the surrounding text. It looks no different. And again, that's just a subjective decision on our part. You can certainly style your link text to stand out, to be underlined, to do all sorts of things. This is just something that we decided, and it's not necessarily right or wrong. But when I hover over it, it does become white, although seeing it do that is probably very minimal. If we used different colorings, it would become much more obvious that a color change was happening. But you'll notice as we hover over it, we're seeing the color change, and we don't see any type of text decoration either. There's no underline at all to that particular link. Going back to Edit Plus, the next thing is, okay, how are we causing that orange image to show up basically behind the date? And that's happening as a result of this span tag. Now, frequently inside of span tags, you're going to find that they have some type of additional attribute, typically class, like class equals something, right? That's very, very common. In this case, I decided not to. This is just something that, I guess, how do I make this clear? Assigning classes or assigning IDs is a good thing, but you don't need to write any more code than I guess is necessary. So in this particular case, because I had a different way to attack it, I knew that this span tag also lived inside of this div class of title. I could basically use this attribute, this class attribute, to control this span rather than having to add yet another bit of code that says span class equals, orange or something. Going back to the CSS now, we're going to find, let's see, we're looking at the link standard and the hover effect, and now we're looking at what happens when we find a span tag. And you know that it's trying to attack the tag as opposed to a class or an ID because there's nothing else other than span, right? There's no number sign, there's no period, so we're not trying to look for something that has a class or an ID. We're actually looking for something that is the actual HTML span tag itself. So if it finds a span tag itself inside of something that has a class of title, inside of something that has a class of COL-1, column 1, inside of something that has an ID of footer-1, here's what you're supposed to do. We're using the background property to call out a particular image through the URL. We're telling it to look in the images folder, and then once it gets inside of the images folder to look for an image named orange.png. And we're telling the background color basically through this value to be transparent, because this is a transparent PNG image. By default, this wouldn't change if I got rid of it in most browsers, but just so you know, by default, the browser do try to assign a white color to backgrounds. So this basically just reiterates our desire that we don't want any color to be shown behind this image. This image is a transparent PNG image, and we don't want any browsers to have the ability to show white behind it, because that would look ugly. We get back to my favorite display inline block, which again, I have a hard time explaining. We'll talk about this in just a second. But we're dealing with basically, just so you understand visually what we're dealing with that orange image that's behind the date. So we're setting a particular font size for the text that shows over it. It's supposed to be italic. It's supposed to be bold. We are giving a height value, not font height, but height value to the entire area. The height value, again, is being set by basically the image height. We're giving it margin to the right, basically pushing the corresponding text that's next to it further over to the right through margin right. We're giving it some padding to the top of 2 pixels. We're telling the text that's inside this area, which is that date text, to text align center. And we're setting the vertical alignment of that text with the vertical -align property to middle. And then we're telling it to be overall a maximum of, or the width is 39 pixels. Again, that's the width of the image. So we'll discuss, or just basically show you everything except for the inline block here for just a second, going back to look at the image. All we're really dealing with is this image itself, and because we've caused it to be a background image, the text has no problem sitting over the top of it. And you can see that the text is editable. It's not part of the image dynamically, as new posts were made. If we created this as a theme, then the new post dates would show up over the image without any problem. The space to the right of it is happening because of the margin value, and the centering nature is happening because of the text align. The vertical nature is happening because of the vertical align, and it's kind of hard to see probably, but that text is in fact italicized there. There's really nothing else overly interesting in this block, and we've got more stuff to deal with over here. So let's jump to column number 2. Column number 2 is the most simplistic, which is a good thing. And I guess let's go look at the HTML first. We know that the H4 is being attacked through CSS kind of more globally through the cascade effect. So it's already being handled as far as its font size being 24 pixels and its color white, etc. We've already talked about that, so we don't need to revisit it. We have something, a new div class. You'll see that it also has a class of title, remembering that anytime you're using classes, you have the ability to reuse them multiple times on a page, whereas anything with an ID needs to be used once per page. So this div, right, let's see, it starts there and it ends here. Nope, right there. Just this top line is just controlling the word business name. Then we've got line breaks, basically used to force new lines, but without extra space top and bottom like a paragraph would. And then we've got the phone information, the email information. It's not a link, it's just text. And we're using another span tag to control the way that the styling is styled for the phone number itself. And so let's kind of look at that. So how are we causing the business name to be orange and the phone number to be orange? Is basically happening because of this additional, the div with a class of title in this area and the span tag. Go look at the CSS again. We're now looking for the CSS that controls, controls column 2. So when it finds something with a class of title, now this time, even though earlier we were, if I scroll up a little bit, even though we were looking for a class of title here, this was looking for a class of title that was contained inside of something with column 1. So now what we're saying is anytime you find something with a class of title inside of something that's column 2, inside of the ID footer 1, here's what you're supposed to do. Make the foreground color orange, set the font size to 20 pixels, make it bold, and assign margin. Here's another thing to point out. I've mentioned it before, but margin has the ability to take a negative value. You see this has got a margin top of -5 pixels, where padding cannot. Padding can only have a positive value. Margin has the ability to have a negative value. So this then is controlling the orange text of the title of that business name. And then down here, column 2, again, it says if you find a span tag inside of something with a class of column 2, inside of something with an ID of footer 1, also make it that same orange color. Okay, so let's talk about this and about the negative margin for just a second. So this title is orange because of the CSS that we just reviewed, because this was wrapped in a div with a class of title, and this is orange because of that specific span tag and the corresponding CSS. And of course the sizing of this text is larger than the surrounding 2, again because of the same CSS rule. The margin, the negative margin, is being attached to, if I remember correctly, it's being attached to the title, the business name. So let's do this. Let me just show you what happens. Let's just set margin top to 0. So if we set margin top to 0, meaning no margin top at all, you'll notice that the business name text is going to change. It's going to push things down. Negative margin values gives you the ability to kind of like more infinitely control the exact layout of something. Now, does that look bad? No, but if you put a vertical line across the page, you'll notice that this bottom area of the words business name is at a different height than the bottom area of we hired a CEO. So I just used negative margin to basically force it to go upwards, and that's what you kind of need to know. You can use negative margin to make it go up or to make it go to the left typically. So the negative margin, -5 pixels, basically says start from the 0 point where margin is 0 and then basically force it upwards by 5 pixels because of the negative margin value, and that's what's allowing me to override the normal positioning or order of things. So that's it really for column 2. Now to column 3, and this is where we start dealing with this particular form. The form itself is pretty simple. There's only 3 input areas basically. Actually 2 input areas and a text area. There's an input area for name, for email, and then a text area for the comment. And again, we're not getting into the connection between the form and the PHP or what's being used to control sending the actual data that's collected from the form. But let's just talk about this just in general. You'll notice that the layout's nice, that it's flush to the right. This text area is flush to the left of this area. You also notice that each of the input fields and the text area field has kind of a lightish, mediumish gray kind of color in it by default. If I hover over it, it probably looks white, but it's not. It's a lighter gray. And if I click inside of any one of these areas, it becomes pure white. Maybe that stands out a little bit more. You can see a difference between this area now and this area here. This is working through a new thing that we haven't discussed at all called focus. It's another pseudo element, or another, yeah, it's exactly what it is. It's a pseudo element. We're attacking the changing of the color by the default state on hover, another pseudo element, and then we're also attacking it through the pseudo element called focus. And focus is hard for me to explain, but I guess I can just say it this way. An element is said to have focus, I guess, when it's active, and it doesn't necessarily become active, even though you're hovering over it. It doesn't necessarily become active until the user actually clicks their left mouse button, and you can see that now that there's a blinking cursor to tell you that you can type text in this box. And as soon as the user clicks in any one of these boxes, that element is said to have focus, and as a result you can attack that area through the pseudo focus element. So let's go look at the HTML and CSS. The HTML is actually really simplistic, not complex at all. We have a div class with, again, foot widget and with the additional column 3. We're doing the same thing with the heading text, same H4, nothing new there. And the entire form actually only takes up just a few lines. You see that we've opened it with the form tag, which is standard and typical. You may see more attributes in a lot of forms than this. Typically, a lot of forms you're going to see have a class or an ID attribute added to them. But at minimum, the form needs to know two things. It needs to have an action statement, and it needs to know what method you plan on using. The action statement is basically, what do you want me to do upon somebody actually submitting the form contents. If we were using like a actual contact form frequently written in PHP, we would basically have a URL path or a path to the script, to the PHP script that was going to process the data information. So if you're not familiar with that, you can go do just a Google search for PHP form script, and you'll find lots of free form scripts that you can test out with this, just to kind of see how it works in the background. The PHP contact form script basically is what is the horsepower behind the form that says, okay, now that I've gotten, someone's input a name and an email and give me a message, what do I do with this? Without that script, the form will look like it works, but it won't actually do anything. By default, we've just used the pound sign just to give it a placeholder. The method type is generally, it's going to be either get, G-E-T, or post. You'll have to study up on that a little bit more. Typically, if you're using a contact form script, it's going to be method of post. Same thing if you're using like an autoresponder form script or an autoresponder form for like Aweber, you're going to see that the method is post. Get is typically used if you're trying to pass the information from one page to another page. But post is probably what you're going to see most of the time. So at minimum, the form needs an action and a method. Inside of that, we have a new div with a class of WP-CF7, which we just, again, since we intend to probably turn this into a WordPress theme, we just made it stand for WordPress CF7, contact form 7, because we'll probably integrate it with just that simple contact form script. The div class could be anything you want. Again, this is entirely up to you. Inside of that, you'll see that we've got several paragraph tags, and the first 2 lines, it's fielding the information for name and email. Now, you'll see that I'm using the label tag. And if I highlight the whole thing, you'll see that the label tag is wrapped around name and the label tag is wrapped around email. You don't have to use the label tag. Getting rid of these, completely would work as far as the form is concerned. Of course, it would break the look of it because I am using the label tag to style it, but it's not really something that's as much used for styling, even though you can definitely attack any HTML tag you want on a page. It's really there for accessibility. It's using the label tag basically wrapped around your you're basically saying, hey, look, I want your name and your email, is basically used for people that have screen readers or have visual problems. They can't actually see your screen, and this label tag makes the form more accessible to them. So it's just good practice to use it. Like I said, it will work without it. Next, though, is the input tag. You'll see that we've got input tags for the name and the email, and then we're using what's referred to as the text area tag to cause that larger box to show up where they can enter their message. The input tags, it wants to know what type of an input this is. If you create an input with a type of text, this attribute type equals, in quotes, text, it will create a singular line box, basically the type that you're typically used to seeing for entering a name and an email, maybe a URL, etc. On a page. If you want some type of other form element, then you have to know kind of what you want. In this case, the next area, it's not, and this is something to note, that it's not an input with a type of text area. It's actually a different tag altogether. It's the text area tag is causing the comments box, basically the message box, to appear. And then the last thing is an input with a new type of submit. This is telling it to create a submit type button. The title is optional, but the value is the text that is actually displayed over the submit button itself. So in this case, it says submit. If I wanted to change that to send it to me, something along that lines, and I'll put this back here in just a second. But you'll see that the text in the button now changed to send it to me from submit. So the value statement inside of the submit button is what's causing the text to show up over the button itself. So that's what you need to know about that. We'll get to the CSS here in just a second. The only other thing I'll point out through HTML is, and this doesn't have to be done through HTML. More and more people are getting away from doing this, but I wanted to show you that it can be done through HTML. Not that it's wrong to do so, but more and more you're probably going to want to set your sizing of your text area box through CSS. This extra bit of information, though, these attributes inside of the text area tag, COLS equals, in quotes, 20, rows equals, in quotes, 5. What this is saying is how wide to make the text area box and how tall to make the text area box. So COLS, or columns equals 20, it's interesting because you're not looking at a pixel value. We're so used to looking at things with pixel values, but that's not it at all. It's actually how many characters and there's 20 characters, but the columns, it's actually wider than that. So that's kind of interesting. Maybe it's just because of the font size, but the wider the column value is set, basically, the wider your area is set. The height of this is 4 rows. And if you make the value higher or larger, and it'd be easier for us to do that to make the width wider because that entire column is set infinitely in width. If I were to make this a column with a row of 8, I must be overriding it through something else. And that happens. There's Murphy for you. So forget what I just said, even though that is effectively how it works. I'm doing something else that's causing it to override it at the moment. But you can basically change the text area. The adding column spacing is typically going to allow the box to grow wider, except for the fact that we've got it contained in a div with a finite width. And I'm not sure why it didn't allow it to grow since we don't have a maximum height set on this area, but just know that the columns and rows is the values that's allowing you to change the text area, at least typically. Put that back to 5. Let's see. Next, we are styling the inputs through these new classes. And you'll notice again that we have, like before, we have 2 different classes attacking this because of these spaces between them. There's the your name and the your email class, both of which live inside of the other class, WPCF7-text. So we'll go look at those first. So we have, let's see. Okay, so here is the WPCF7-text class inside of the other, and it's basically listing the entire width as 215 pixels. So this is what's controlling basically the width of those input fields, the name and the email fields. Yeah, Jerry.
Oh, I'm just going to say the next one is why your message area wouldn't change.
Yeah, the next one here. Gotcha, because I have set a finite width and height. Thank you. Sometimes you even forget what you do yourself. So the text area here, I've got it set just to take ultimate control over it. We have a height and a width statement. So basically Jerry's saying is if we were to comment out, that's also what's overriding the columns, which is why it's not technically 20 spaces. If we were to change this and comment out the height, and if we were to go back and change the rows to 8 and go look at this, we should see that the text area grows in height, and it does. And that's the reason why obviously I've stopped it, because I don't want it to overflow into the second footer 2 area. And there's certain things that it's kind of weird through CSS. If I add more text, it'll grow this area, but you can just see it here that this area now wants to overflow onto the footer 2 area, and that's not obviously what we want to do. And this becomes a kind of a different, more complex thing to talk about, but we're controlling it through that value, and probably here, even you can see it where it says rows equals 5 is still too much. Well, realistically, looking at that, I would say that the column and rows is extraneous.
Well, you'd want to have it if you're going to have, if CSS fails, that's the reason why you would do it, but it is extraneous. One thing I wanted to say while you're typing is these, in CSS, the height is not in characters again. Even though we're talking about text area, the height and width that you're setting is in measurements for CSS. Why in the HTML it was character height and width.
Right. So basically what Jerry just said is in the CSS we're setting it basically in an actual physical space, 48 pixels by 273, whereas in the HTML version, when we had columns equal to 20 and rows equal to 5, these are not pixel values. These are actual character values. And if without the CSS, it should show basically 20 characters in width and 5 rows of text in height. That's basically what's happening as a result of the HTML code. Since Jerry finds a benefit here, I'll go ahead and leave that intact exactly as it was. But that's the reason why we weren't able to override the CSS through the HTML, because the CSS is taking precedence. So let's see, where were we at? We have basically, let's see, we have your email up here. We're looking for name as well. That's why it's both. Okay, so here's where I told you to pay attention to inside of the selector if you find a comma, and there is one right there, in this case on line 395. When you find a comma, it's stating a particular selector attack, well, basically this CSS declaration, attack it to both this selector and to this one. It's an and. So it's not where you're looking from the right, this inside of this inside of this. That's true for this first block, but then it stops. It as soon as you see that comma, you don't say, oh, inside of something with ID of footer 1, inside of something with class of your name. That's not accurate. So this comma basically is making this entire rule attached anytime that you find something with a class of your -email inside of something with a class of WPCF7, inside of something with an ID of footer 1, do this. Also, because of this comma, anytime you find something with a class of your name inside of this, float it to the right. So that float to the right is allowing these input fields to show up aligned basically to the right. That's what's basically causing that to happen. If we look now at the labels, each one of those label tags, basically I'm telling them to float to the left. That's aligning them to the left. We're setting a particular line height and font size to them as well. Lower down now, we are looking at the text area, and the text area by default has this color. Again, you can use 3 values as opposed to all 6 like here if the numbers, or basically the value is the same across all 6. By that I mean this all 6 Fs can also be just 3 Fs. So whenever you see colors being called out with just 3 values, it basically means if you were to duplicate it, that is the exact same color either way. So you might as well just shorten it, make it easier on yourself, and take up just a teeny bit less in file size. We're setting a background color for the text area to this medium gray color. There's also a border line that's very hard to see, but there's a border line around the text area. We're setting the color initially, meaning the foreground color or color of text, as white, and then we're adding padding. Basically, we're moving the text away from the edges of the text area through the padding, 4 pixels to the top and bottom, 5 pixels to the right and left. Going back to the site, we're not going to be able to see white text in here because we're controlling it with something else, but that default color is the color that we've set it. And if I click inside here, you'll notice that we have a little bit of padding. The cursor doesn't line up right hard against the box either in height or width because of the padding statement. Next is what we're talking about, these pseudo elements in regards to hover and focus. So again, look for commas. We see that we have one here. It's saying anytime that you find this declaration and or this one, here's what to do. In this case, we're attacking the text area tag with the pseudo element of :hover. So anytime the user hovers over the text area, change the background from this one to this lighter gray. Change actually the border statement is the same, and change the color of the text as well. If, however, the user clicks in that area, which is where we get now the pseudo element for focus, change the actual background color to white, and now make the color or the foreground color of the text to this. Actually, it's the same as on hover, which is why if we look up here, we're not going to get white text when we click in the box. We're going to get this text, because whenever someone clicks inside of the text area or even any of those input fields, they are going to activate the focus pseudo element, and it's going to use this CSS. So going back to the live page, again, if I don't hover over it, we get the default color. If I hover over it, we get the lighter gray color, and if I click in it, we get the white color, and if I type in it, we get dark gray, almost black text. So that's kind of the hows and whys of that is happening. And let's see here. Let's go look at the HTML again. Let's see if there's anything else in that area that we needed to really talk about. I guess the submit button. So the submit button, let me go look at the live example. You'll notice that we have white or light colored text, at least, on a dark gray background. If I hover over it, you're going to see that that changes. The text changes from light to dark, and the background color changes also from dark to light. So basically just a reverse effect of that. And this is now the first time that you're going to see kind of a new selector through CSS. And there's a lot of complex elements to CSS, and of course with CSS3 there's a whole lot of new things that you can do, from rounding border edges to now even creating gradients to creating drop shadows on text or on boxes, etc. CSS3 gets even more complex than basically what we've been working with, which is primarily CSS2. But as you build your knowledge, you're going to realize that there's a variety of very unique ways to select or attack HTML elements in order to control them through your CSS. And the next one happens as a result of something called a selector that's called the attribute selector. So here's what I mean. If you recall through our HTML training, this is a HTML element or tag, the input element. Everything that's inside of here, where you have a value equals and then something in quotes, these are all attributes. These are attributes or additional pieces of information added to a particular HTML tag or element. So this attribute is a type attribute. The type equals, in this case, submit. This is a title attribute. The title equals submit, this time with an uppercase S. This is the value attribute. In this case, the content matches that of the title, submit with an uppercase S. But these three additional pieces of information are all attributes. So we're going to go back to the CSS and take a look at something, and this might be something that you've seen before and wondered what in the world it was, and if so, now is your opportunity to kind of get an idea of what's happening. This CSS right here looks kind of strange. We've got these new square brackets going on, and it's something that we haven't discussed at all up to this point. This is what's referred to, and again, understand that each one of these CSS rules, the very first line is the selector. Basically, what am I trying to select, and then the individual declarations of what you're trying to do whenever you encounter this particular selector. So line 426 for me on Edit Plus says anytime you find an input tag and in square brackets This is the square brackets indicate that you are using the attribute selector. And there's a variety of different ways to do that. We're only going to deal with this one particular way. It says anytime that you find an input tag with a specific attribute of type that has a specific value of submit, all in lowercase, do this. Also, if you find the input tag with a class of submit, do the same thing. So if either one of those two situations is true, this is what I want you to do. Anything that has a class of submit that is an input tag basically with a class of submit, or an input tag that has a attribute for type equal to submit, this is what I want you to do. I want you to cause the background, in this case the background color, to be this particular color of gray. I don't want you to assign any border line around the area or the submit button basically. I want you to cause the foreground color to be white. This is the first time we've talked about the ability to change or control the cursor of the visitor. In this case, I want you to, when they basically put their cursor over the submit button, to cause it to be the pointer. And there are different ways that you can do that. Look at the w3schools.com for the cursor property, and you'll see a bunch of different options that are available for the cursor. But we're basically controlling the effect, basically, that the visitor is going to see when they hover over our submit button. It's going to cause their cursor to be the pointer. We're setting the font size for the text that shows up over the submit basically area. The padding, basically the space around the background color, basically causing that area to grow a little bit to support space for our text. The position we've talked about before being relative or absolute, and the fact that that's kind of very hard for me to describe visually, so you'll just have to go back and review our other training on position, either relative or absolute, or take a look at W3 Schools and look at the visual explanations of the differences there. The text align, meaning the text inside of the submit button, we want to center it, and the width of the button, we want it to make it auto in width, meaning basically that it can grow. And you saw earlier that I typed in new text for the submit button, and it automatically expanded to contain the new text. So this new attribute selector is being used to cause this to happen. In addition to that, we also have the pseudo hover and the pseudo focus elements being used in addition. So again, we've got a comma. Anytime we find an input that has a attribute of type that equals to submit and has focus, meaning someone's clicked on it, do this, or if they've hovered over it. So whether they've clicked on it or hovered over it doesn't really matter in this case. We're assigning the same rule to it. We're changing the background color from dark to light. We're changing the text color from white to black. So we're just basically reversing the two, and that's what's happening there, to cause the submit button to have a dark background and light text to a submit button that has a light background and dark text. And that's basically what's happening there, is all being attached or attacked through the attribute type selectors. So let's see, what else do we have left? I think that's pretty much it in regards to the form. Lastly, we just have the information on the bottom, and I just need to fly through this because I can see we're already 15 minutes over time. We'll tab over to the next page, and we'll see that we have basically a copyright statement attached to a particular business name. We've got some text links that show up horizontally, have an underline on them when we hover. We've got another piece of text down here, website designed by your name, and it doesn't look like it's a link, but if I hover over it, you see it changes to white because it is a link. And then we've got some horizontal social icons. So this whole area, again, understand, is now footer 2. We just finished the area with footer 1. We'll go take a look at footer 2. So footer 2, if we look at the new HTML page, this is the content that we're dealing with right now. It's not a whole lot of content, but we do have a number of different elements inside of it. Inside of footer 2, we do have another div, again with a class of content. And then we have two new divs, at least two main divs, one with the class of left and one with the class of social. So go back to the CSS. We're looking for, what are we controlling for div footer 2, the content, and we'll start with left. So let's see. Footer 2, anything with an ID of footer 2, we're setting a particular height, so the height is fixed. In this case, it's not set to grow. If you wanted to change that in the future, you could set a min height of 80 pixels and then allow the content to grow if you'd like. But right now we've fixed the height at 80 pixels. The background color is almost black. All ones in hexadecimal is as close to black as you can get. I mean, it's not technically, but it's very close to all black. And then we have that border top, that extra little line that I mentioned earlier, because we have two thin border lines that basically butt up to each other, one that's underneath footer 1 and one that's above footer 2 to cause a kind of a cool little effect. In this case, it's kind of a lighter gray, or the one above it is darker. And that's what's happening as a result of that. The class of content is now controlling the width of the entire area at 950 pixels, and then the other is setting the margin. And actually got three values here, and I don't normally use three values. I typically either use one value, which if you use one value for margin, you're saying to set that same value to top, right, bottom, and left. If you use two values, remember that the first refers to top and bottom, and the second refers to left and right. But in this case, we're actually using three, and three, it gets more complex, which is why I don't typically use it either for myself or to teach it, but since it's here, we'll cover it. If you ever see a value for a margin or padding that has three values, then here's basically what's happening. The first value is simply the top. The second value is right and left, and the third value is the bottom. So again, if you see three values for margin or padding, the first value says to give 20 pixels of margin or 20 pixels of space above this particular div with a class of content. The second value is right and left. That auto value again is centering the content on the page. And the third value is assigned to the bottom. In this case, it's 0. So again, the div with a class of content is simply just it's specifying the width of this area, and it's also causing it to be centered, and it's also assigning a particular amount of margin around it. Next, we're looking for the class of left, and I'm seeing social first. Again, it really doesn't matter, but let's see. Doesn't look like I've actually assigned any specific CSS to left. It's really happening as a result of the social. So let's go back and look at the HTML so I can show you what I mean. The div class of left, unless I've added something that I'm not seeing at the moment, and I don't think so because I try to put all the CSS together in one nice neat space, is really just for our own benefit. We are attacking CSS for this social, and I'm sure we have CSS for copyright and design. We'll see that here in a minute. But the div class of left is really just a container area for us as a visual reminder that this is the content that's showing up to the left. If we look at the div with a class of copyright, and then the div with a class of designed is really where the next bit of CSS is that's going to control this area. You'll notice that we have an HTML entity, the ampersand COPY semicolon is basically outputting the copyright symbol, 2012 business name, so just raw HTML text, and then we've got a list of links, terms, privacy policy, sitemap, and a link for back to top. There's nothing overly fancy here going on. These could be done in an unordered list set to inline so that they flowed horizontally, but this is just basically just a simple list of text links. The only thing I guess more interesting is this back to top link. You'll notice that we have the Ahref, like all these others, set to default with the number sign. I really wouldn't recommend that you do it just this way, but it does work. If you were to leave the hyperlink reference as the number sign, just point that out to you. We are now at the bottom of this page, and like I said, we really haven't linked these anywhere. They're all linked to just the number sign, the pound sign, just as placeholders. But you will notice something. If I do click this link, what's going to happen is it actually does take us right back to the top of the page. So there is actually a connection with the number sign and its ability to actually force the visitor back to the top of a page. So you could use that in effect for creating a back to top link. It's really not the best way to do it. The best way to do it is to use or call out a specific ID. And I guess I should show you that since we're talking about it. If you look up in your code and you've set something with an ID like of header, knowing that that's basically the top of your page, instead of causing that URL at the bottom in the footer to simply be just the number sign, you can look for an ID, something that you've labeled higher up in it, and use the actual ID for it in total. So in this case, you're using the number sign and then the word header. It basically says to move the, oops, put it in the wrong space. I wanted that for the back to top link, not your name. It says basically just take the visitor back to the area that was styled with that particular ID. So if I go back to the live version now, we're not going to see any change really. It's going to take us back to the top, but now it's basically coded with the ID of header rather than just the numeric sign. But either way works. Just wanted to point that out. So let's see here. We're looking again for the div with a class of copyright. We have links inside of it, the A tag basically, and then we're looking for the div with a class of designed. Go back to the CSS. All right, so we know that we're in footer 2. The copyright class is here, and it's saying, all it's saying is basically to set the foreground color or the text color to all C's, which is a lightish gray, and it's also telling it to alter the font size to 14 pixels, and that's all it's doing. Anything with a class of designed, it's giving it a particular margin to the top, and that's because if we go to the live site, the content that's under the design class is this one here at the bottom. So it's spacing these 2 lines of text away by that margin element, a margin rule basically, or property. It's giving it a different color than the rest of the content, so it's no longer a lighter gray, it's a darker gray. It's the same font size. However, it says if it finds a link, an A tag, inside of that class of designed, it's supposed to keep the color the same. Again, don't let the browser use the default blue color, and it's using the pseudo element the a:hover to say, keep the color the same. Actually, don't change it. I take that back. Yes, change it back to the default. So the links in this designed area are the darker gray, and if it's hovered over it, make it the lighter gray, which is the same color as the text above inside of the copyright. And also to make it with text decoration of none, so don't underline it. Going back to the live site, that's what we get. We get this text up here is the CCC color. This text down here is the 666 color. And if I hover over just the link portion, you'll notice if I put my cursor over the text that isn't inside of the A tag, nothing happens. But as soon as I get over the your name part, which is linked, it changes to the same color as above it, and you'll notice that it has no text decoration, no underline. If we go back to the CSS and look at the, let's see here, we're not attacking the A tag specifically inside of the copyright class, and that can kind of get confusing. The question then becomes, well, why isn't it not underlined by default? And that is because there's CSS code that's above it somewhere that's cascading down onto the A tag that's telling the A tag or the links basically to not be underlined by default. So since we've done that globally, and I'd have to do a search for it to find that specific area, but I know it to be true, somewhere up in the code I basically turned off the underline effect, the text decoration, to none, basically for the A tag globally. And so because that's happening, I don't have to specify that in the regular rule. But additionally, I don't also have to turn on the underline, because that's a normal effect of a link. Links are typically underlined, and so I'm actually not having to style the standard and the hover effect, because it's being controlled basically somewhere else inside the CSS code, and the cascade effect is having it fall upon this area. The only thing we're basically doing is controlling the color of the font. So the other area is the social area that's over here to the right, and that's the last little bit. So the class of social, the first thing you'll notice is we're using float to float it over to the right side of the container. Well, what's the container? The container is the div with the class of content that we've set to be 950 pixels wide and centered. So inside of that container area, float anything with a class of social all the way to the right. So here's basically what I mean. If we look at the HTML, we'll see that we have at the moment, let's see, 5 different social icons. If I were to take and duplicate the last one 2 more times and save it, we're going to see that the position on the right stays intact. It's not going to change, but it's going to move to the left. And you'll see that that's true. The right positioning stayed intact. The icons started to float left. So obviously there's plenty of space to add more social icons into this layout, but the positioning stays exactly where I want it to be because of that float right. That's what's basically aligning it hard to the right-hand side of the content div. Let's see what else we're doing with the social class. Basically, it's just a listing of linked images, nothing fancy about it. There's the A tag with the default number sign linked for the href, saying where is this image supposed to be linked? It's to here, so the real URL obviously would go between the quotation marks. Where am I supposed to find the image? Well, we're using the image tag to know that it's an image. The source for the image is inside of the images folder. Look for an image that's named facebook.png. We're setting a width and height value for the image. It's 30 pixels in width and height, as are all of them. And again, it's always wise to use alt text. Basically, it's required if you want your pages to validate in XHTML or HTML5. And then this ending A tag says I'm finished with the link. So again, remember that anything between the opening and closing A tags is going to be linked. In this case, it's an image as opposed to text, which is happening up here just a little bit above, also in the same footer area. So that's really all that's happening here. The positioning of that now is happening because of the class of social. Go back to the CSS, and we'll see that we're right here telling it to float to the right, and right here we're saying if you find an image tag, which all of those icons are, they're images, inside of a class of social, inside of something that has the ID of footer 2, then all I want you to do is to add a little margin to the left of 10 pixels. All that's doing is controlling the spacing between each one of those icons.